All right, thank you. Today is about sort of like about how to build your team. Maybe before I jump in, I can give you just a very quick background on my own history and my history with CourseHorse. So we got started, I guess, so I was a Stern alum, graduated from undergrad with a finance marketing major. Went to do tech consulting right after school because my goal was really to learn how to get websites and technology built, and I just didn't have any of those kinds of technical skills. So I spent 2 years doing consulting, technology consulting, and I was very fortunate to be put on a project working for the Princeton Review, where we were essentially trying to help this large test prep company figure out the future of online test prep. And so it was this project where we were ripping out all their old systems, redesigning their learning management system and their website. So I learned literally all the skills that I wanted to learn. And while I was there, I was actually in a focus group with a bunch of parents talking about how they find classes for their kids. And one of the parents said, hey, is there a place I can go to find all of the SAT classes from Kaplan and the Princeton Review and all these other companies and make a decision? And I thought, wow, there is nothing like that. And it would be really amazing to have some sort of central educational resource that would make it easy for people to find and compare classes. So I ended up calling my now business partner, and she thought it was a great idea. She saw, hey, all the classes have empty seats. The margins are pretty high on a per student basis, so there's definitely a business here. But why just test prep classes? Why not cooking and art and dance and technology? Like there must be tens of thousands of these local classes, and people, having the same trouble searching for them. And so we ended up seeing an opportunity. We did a little bit of research before we jumped in, talked to, surveyed, a couple hundred New Yorkers, talked to a bunch of schools, kind of validated, did a lot of the lean startup stuff. Ended up quitting our jobs, jumped into the NYU venture competition, and while we found a vendor to build the website. While they were building it, we were signing the first group of schools here in New York, and ultimately we launched in the summer of 2011, won the NYU venture competition, and kind of got going. So at that point, we sort of, we actually turned down an initial round of funding, decided to bootstrap it for as long as we could to generate enough traction so that when we went out fundraising, we would get better terms than we would have gotten at that time. And then ultimately in the summer of 2012, once we had solved a number of the different problems that we kind of needed to solve in order to really have a business, we were able to raise a seed round of funding of $500K. With that, we hired the first couple members of the team, and really that was like the first time we experienced like hiring and team building and things like that. And then, with that team of 5 or 6 people, we grew something like 25 times over about 18 months. And then in early 2014, we were able to close another round of funding, about $1 million, mainly from angel investors again, as we were still trying to essentially avoid going to VCs as long as we could. And then from there, it was really about expanding nationally, starting to go to LA, Chicago, testing out different hypotheses for how we could grow the business, getting better at all the things we were decent at. That was really the point at which we really started, I would say, thinking seriously about hiring and team culture and things like that. We had about 12 or 13 people at that point. And then, over the last couple of years, it's sort of just like a standard set of figuring out new marketing channels, signing new and better schools, optimizing, the conversion rate and the operations for the students. We raised another round of funding earlier in 2016, or just at the end of 2015, which was about $4 million from more of a strategic partner than a VC. Again, our tendency is always to try and not take VC money, as it's just a very different sort of instrument for a different purpose. But since then, again, I would say, we've grown the team to about 16, 17 people. That's here in New York. We actually have about 5 or 6 people who work remotely here in the US, and then another team of like 150 people in the Philippines. So our team is vastly distributed, and we deal with a lot of people. So yeah, over time, we've learned obviously a tremendous amount about all this stuff that comes with working with people and building an organization. And so I guess the goal today is really to share some of those lessons learned, and hopefully point you in some of the right directions as you guys are getting started building your own organizations. Okay, so I kind of broke it up into these 3 different buckets. My sense is always when it comes to the people side of your organization, you always start with your values, and I'll kind of talk through what that means and what values are. But for me, this is, and my partner Katie, this is where it started for us, is figuring out who do we want to be. What you find is that your company is a reflection of yourself, right? So whoever you are, whatever your values are as founders, that's what your company is essentially going to resemble. If you are generous, if you're caring, if you care about the customer, if you care about your teammates, like you will generally and naturally attract people who are like that, and that'll be the organization that you build. If you're selfish, if you're kind of greedy, if you're stingy, if you're, I don't know, like hard on people, like that's the type of people you'll attract, and that's how your customers will experience your brand. And so everything for us when it comes to people starts with values. Second thing I wanted to go through is a little bit more of the operations. Like the recruiting process for me reveals a lot about how you think about hiring and how you think about people. And it was one of the biggest blind spots for us when we really started to try to put a process to it. So that'd be helpful to talk through. And then things we've learned. It's like everything else that kind of fits in, and we can talk through lessons at the end and then open it up for questions. Also, I would say feel free to stop me in the middle and ask questions. I don't actually know how long this presentation is, so I'm just going to kind of make my way through it. But if you have a question, just shout it out or raise your hand or something like that, and we can shoot from there. Okay, so as I said, it looks like I was already ahead of myself, right? Your team will be a reflection of yourself and your values, right? I define culture, right? A lot of people like throw this word around and try to figure out like, what does this mean? Well, I want to have great culture in my company. What does that mean? Ultimately, it's really this like common set of behaviors, right? And it's a common set of behaviors that results from your implicit or explicit values, right? So values, and again, we'll talk about those in a second, right? Like you have values whether you know it or not. You operate based on certain mental rules, on certain frameworks, and like some of those may be implicit, where you're not saying, hey, these are my values, but you're operating in a way where if one of your close friends was asked, they could identify your values. Then you might have explicit ones. You might take the time to say, these are our company's values, and here's who we want to be, as we build an organization. And as I say here, right, all of it starts with hiring, right? If you hire people whose values align with your own values, then you'll start to more intentionally create a culture that's based on these values. If you don't think about values when you hire, maybe you'll get lucky, right? You might just, through a gut feel perspective, attract people who, align with the values you want your company to represent, but you might not, right? And then over time, you'll naturally sense that something is wrong with, somebody on your team, and you won't be able to really describe why. So starting with a language of values and a sort of methodology based on values allows you to sort of be a little bit more intentional about the people that you're hiring and therefore the culture that you're creating. Okay, so how do we develop our values, right? So this is what we did. We took this exercise from Jim Collins, who wrote a couple famous business books. Basically, you pick the core members of your team. When we did this, we were 6 people. Right? And so we just picked everybody and said, okay, you're all going to help us with this. What we did was we looked at a bunch of the values statements of other companies that we admired. So I think it was like Zappos and like Amazon and, I don't know, like we picked like 5 or 6 other companies. And we used those to train us to understand like what is a value statement, like what is a value, and to provide us with some inspiration for like what our values might be, which things do we really agree with or resonate with. Then, and this is like an important, I guess, generally way that we approach work. It's like we want people to do like deep digging on their own before being affected by other people's opinions. So we said, hey, everybody go off on your own and figure out for yourself personally what values you would hold true for yourself, whether or not you are at this company, right? So no matter where you go in life, like what are your values based on some of the inspiration that you've seen already? Right? Then you get together as a group and you identify the common patterns, and you can kind of say, hey, it seems like everybody in the room really agrees with these 7 or 8 things, right? Then it helps to put words to them, right? So when we say we're customer focused, like what does that mean exactly? Different people might have different opinions about what that means. So you want to really solidify that into a set of behaviors, right? That, or sorry, a set of words that like define this is what this value is. The next step, right, is because all culture is a set of behaviors, right? It helps to start thinking through what behaviors will you then sort of begin to intentionally create at the company as a result of your values. So for example, we can say, hey, we want to be a very customer-focused company. Well, what does that mean for us, right? How will we know if we are customer-focused or not? What behaviors really embody that? Right? And then you can start to create a roadmap or a set of behaviors that you're committing to, which make you sort of intentionally go through the motions of embodying that value. And over time, as you continue going through those motions, they'll become more natural for you. And so that's how that value then finds its way into your culture. And then finally, you put in place a way to measure it, right? And like this is incredibly important, and the number of different ways that we've put in place to get a sense for whether we're living up to our values has only increased over time. In the beginning, we said, hey, we'll do an annual check-in, and over time we realized like it's just not enough, because it's so easy as your organization is shifting, as your company mission and vision, maybe all those things are shifting. Your values, you really want to stay pretty solid and pretty core. And if you only check in on it once a year amid a huge amount of change during the course of the year, you'll find that in many ways you've like gotten off track, and you're constantly, or like once a year, like, wow, we're way far away from where we want it to be, right? So it's better to check in more frequently and to have a sense for what you're doing that gut checks whether or not you're really living up to your values or not. And in a way, right, focusing effort here is sort of like the root cause, right? So if you focus your effort here, then a lot of the other things that plague organizations will disappear, right? Because if you focus on sort of the roots, or like the base of the whole thing, which is the values and the culture, then a lot of like politics and ego and all these other things tend not to be as big of an issue if you get these pieces right. Okay, so these are our values. I started with customer focus. For us, this notion of starting with why is really critical. We find that for startups, if you lose sight of your goal in either the highest strategy that you have or the lowest level like task that you're doing, you'll just consistently be off course. So for us, like goal focus was really critical. Creative execution, we've now renamed this sort of like problem solving. For us, like a startup is a series of problems that need to be solved. And so we really wanted to commit to that process and commit to the joy of problem solving. We wanted to hire people who love solving problems, not people who are frustrated by them. Ownership, right? So it's a sense of like, look, when there's so few people on the team, you want to be able to look left and look right and know that these people are going to carry their weight and get all the stuff done and pick up all the stuff that's falling through the cracks, right? So you don't have time to really take care of all these other people. Everyone needs to take care of themselves, but also take care of everybody else. So ownership ended up being really critical. Adaptability. This is actually a new one. This we adopted early last year. The reason was that we found that any startup, right, and ours in particular, right, changes courses many, many times, right? And what my co-founder and I found was that every time we changed course, we felt like we had to apologize to the team for changing directions, or for saying, hey, 3 months ago we thought this, and now we've realized based on the data that this isn't the best way forward, so we're going to change. We always felt like we were apologizing. We always felt like we were doing the wrong thing, when in fact, that's the process of a startup, is to constantly test, iterate, measure, and like figure out what's right and change courses to embrace, what your latest perspective on the best idea is. And so we felt like, hey, rather than having an organization that's frustrated by this, let's commit to it. Let's like make this a value. Let's go so far as to make it a value, so that when a change happens, everyone says like, okay, like as long as we understand why, coming back to starting with why, right? As long as we understand why, we're excited to embrace this change, and we know that it means the best for the company. And so it's interesting how just making it a value has like shifted everyone's perspective in the last year, and now you can feel at the company an energy when it comes to things are about to change again. People get actually more excited than they get frustrated or disappointed. Powerful sense of team, right? For us, in many ways, building a company was always more about building the group of people that we wanted to spend all of the livelong day with, right? And so a huge part of like our values is like, we want to care about these people, and we want them to kind of care about each other and to care about us. And so we found that like, there are certain people that just put a sense of we before I in their work, and those were the people that we wanted on the team. Integrity and authenticity, again, for us, it's like we wanted to draw a sharp line in the sand that said like, hey, we never have to do the wrong thing because we're afraid of not existing tomorrow. Let's always do the right thing because we have nothing to be afraid of at the end of the day. Authenticity, we felt like went along with this. A lot of times fear is what prevents people from being authentic. They feel like they have to put up a wall of some kind. And we found that in our interactions with our customers, we were always most successful. And with each other, we were always most successful when we were just exactly who we are, when we presented ourselves as people rather than as like an organization. And then lifelong learning. Obviously, we're a learning-focused company, so that was a big part of this. But also, there was a sense that when we started the company, we were like 22, 23 years old, and so it was the sense of, hey, we have a huge amount to learn along the way, but we want to again embrace that, not be frustrated by it. So we want to embrace the challenge. We want to be humble, even if we've gotten very good at something. We want to always be open to new ideas and accepting that the world is changing so fast that the best practice of yesterday could just be sort of obsolete today. So let's constantly be learning. And so, again, we spend a lot of time on like figuring out like what are these values? What do they like literally mean for us? And how are we? Which behaviors exist at our company to help us stay true to them? How we live our values, right? So number one is hiring, right? So like I said, it all starts with the people you bring on the team. So you need a way to identify whether the people you're thinking about hiring, like, kind of share your values or not, right? And if they don't, you have to think like twice about bringing them onto the team. So that's something we can talk about. Annual survey, already mentioned, right? So what we do every year is we have an anonymous survey where we ask people to rate us 1 to 7 on whether or not the company is living up to each value, and then for each value, explain why they rated us that, right? And so it's anonymous and it's totally free form. And then, aligned with our value of transparency, we then share everybody's raw feedback out with the whole team, and then meet for literally 8 straight, or actually now it's like 4 hours a day over our company retreat, and we spend 1 hour per value going through the feedback, identifying themes, identifying what things we want to change, why we're hearing those things, and creating a roadmap of behaviors that we can change in order to better align with what the company thinks, the direction we should be going for that value. Now we do so we also do peer evals, right? So now it's, I think once every 6 months, you are rated against the values by your closest 5 peers. And again, it's a similar thing. It's like, we want to give you a rating to give you a sense of, numerically, where do you score? Usually we actually don't we don't share the number ratings as much. We just use them for the respondent to sort of anchor and say well, are they a 1 or a 7? How does that feel? And then we really take into account the qualitative feedback, share that out with people. And it's a way to make sure that each individual is staying consistent with the values as well. Weekly, monthly meetings. So now we have actually what we call a Friday Feels meeting. We actually sent out a Thursday Thoughts email where we pick one of the values and ask a question related to it, and then people respond anonymously. Very similar to our annual feedback, but we realized that annual wasn't enough, so we started to do a very lightweight version of it weekly. And then every Friday, we'll look at the responses and discuss as a team, and again, identify things we feel good about, things we want to change, and the behaviors that we think could make those things change. So far, that's been really great. We are, right now, I think, debating on, we think 1 week, weekly is too much now. So now we're sort of shifting back to every 2 weeks, and we're feeling like we're finding the right cadence for which we can really talk about the team and culture, and have people feel like when they have a thing that they are frustrated about the whole company, they have a forum to share it very quickly, versus having to wait for an annual survey. Company language, right? So a lot of what the values does is it gives you a language to talk about things, right? So you can say, hey, I don't think this really aligns with our customer focus value. We're planning on blasting this email out, and we have, no idea whether this is something our customers actually care about. Maybe we should send it out to a smaller audience, or maybe we should do some customer interviews first. So you just start to see that when someone has a hesitation to the way that the company is approaching something, we have this language that we can use, and we remind people in the weekly and in the annual stuff, hey, if we feel like we're going off course, you don't have to wait for one of these meetings. You can just use the language of values in order to describe the hesitancy that you're facing. And we internally commit to respecting that, right? So as soon as somebody sort of invokes the values, we know that, okay, everybody needs to lean in and pay attention because this is something that we really care about. A lot of times, so then one-on-ones, right? So another thing we do now that's been transformative for us is my partner and I have one-on-ones with the team every week. So we've got typically 4 one-on-ones per week, so it's 8 per week between the two of us. So that means we get to the whole team, roughly once every 2 weeks. And in the one-on-ones, right, again, it's just a totally open forum for the person to tell us what's going on with them, what are the things that they're happy about, what are they frustrated about, what questions they have, what do they need to properly navigate the company and to feel really great about continuing to be at CourseHorse. Again, values really interplays and sort of underscores what we do in those meetings. And we try to use that language to pull out things that people themselves maybe haven't even put words to yet, so that there's a really good opportunity there. Talked about Friday Feels, and then all other behaviors, right? So the most important thing about establishing these behaviors is that, again, it creates culture, right? So people recognize, wait a second, we do so much stuff for values that values must be really important at this company. Therefore, I should be sort of observing what's happening, all the work that we're doing, the way that the team operates, through this lens of these values. Like, so your commitment to the behaviors is what makes the values important at the company. A lot of companies will create value statements and then never look at the values again. They have them on the website. Maybe they go through them in an orientation in your first week, but then you really never hear about them again. When you create behaviors like this, right, it communicates that these really do matter to us. So call us on our bullshit, right? If we're saying this is a value but we're not living up to it, we should know about that and either decide, actually, we don't really value this after all, or we really need to commit to a course correction of some kind. Okay, so now, right, once we've kind of laid the foundation of values, right, this is like how you're going to hire people, how you're going to create culture at your company, then you think about, like, okay, when you go to hire, right, you can't just hire people for values because obviously you need their skills, right? So we end up hiring for two things, skills and values. Skills is simply put, like, as we think about the needs of the role that we're hiring for, can we be sure that the person can deliver, deliver the work that we need at the quality we expect? And do we feel like the person shares the values that, again, are the kind of cornerstone of our culture? Okay, so this is a sort of sample process. It's not always the same, but this sort of gives you a feel for the way that we approach things, right? So we have an application. So we use a system that, you put in your resume, your cover letter, and then likely you'll answer like a question. And we'll talk about like a skills question. Then actually, before we speak to anybody, right, we'll have a short skills test. So it takes maybe half an hour or something like that. And the reason we do this is because we found that you will get so many applications to a given job and so many of them are unqualified, but it's really difficult to tell from purely a resume or a cover letter whether or not they have even basis like skills for the job, right? And so what we found is that 20 to 30-minute skills test is something most people are willing to do. Right? We don't have a huge drop-off rate after the application. And like, it's just the biggest way to cut down the amount of work you're doing. Make sure that people can like answer very basic questions about the role you're hiring for, right? Then if they pass the skills test, then we're like, great, let's like get to know this person a little bit. So we set up a phone interview. Usually it's like 15 to 30 minutes. Usually it's around 30 minutes. Typically here is when we're asking our first set of values questions, right? And it's sort of, and we'll go through what types of value questions we ask. But here the job is like, let's get to know this person a little bit, make sure that and really the goal is to like sell the candidate on the company, right? This them to be super excited about the role and about like joining the company, right? And it's interesting, right? Because every touch point is your brand, right? Like they're getting a feel for like who you are, how you deal with people, how you communicate. And so we put a lot of work into even automated emails, like how does this flow feel for the candidate? That's something that we put a lot of care into. After the phone interview, so usually, again, we'll also set expectations for what the rest of the process looks like to make sure they're on board. A lot of times we'll talk through what the salary requirements are, like kind of what our range is, so they don't get to the end of the process and feel super disappointed or we're like, wait a second, we're way far, very far away from where we want to be. And yeah, we try to essentially just transparently answer as many questions as we can. Sometimes we'll actively try to talk people out of the role, right? If we think like you can do this job, but we don't think it's something you want to do. So again, we try to be as transparent as possible to save their time and ours. Skills test 2 is like the intense version of the skills test. This is like our last ability to find out, can they do this job? Will we be disappointed in the first 2, 4, 6, 8 weeks if we hand them a task and they're like, I have no idea what you're talking about, right? So we really need, and like this is really critical. We have to, and these are hard to build, right? In a way, you have to know how to do the role yourself in order to really build a good skills test. And if you don't, right, that's where you have to usually bring in help from somebody in your network, right? So when we were hiring for engineering, for example, neither my partner nor I am an engineer. So we needed help hiring for the first few engineering candidates. And then we have a values interview, which we'll talk through, right? So essentially it's a 60 to 90-minute interview. We ask a bunch of what are called behavioral fit questions. And each question calls for a scenario, right? So like, tell me about a time that, right? And it allows the candidate to tell a story, and the story, they don't necessarily always have an idea for what you're asking for, but if you're listening well, right, you'll be able to figure out, does this person share my values or not? Usually we say I have at least 2 people in the room, one to orchestrate the interview and to figure out what the next question should be, and then one to simply listen or to push when you need more information. It's really helpful because figuring out what question to ask next actually takes up like half your brain. And so having one person dedicated to really like taking in the other person's reality is super valuable. And then this we found really critical is like most people will answer at least half the questions with an answer that's a little too vague or just doesn't give you enough information to really make a judgment about whether or not they've like meet your value criteria. And that's where you just like kindly like gently push a little bit further and ask for another story or like, what did you do when, like, what happened next or something like that. And then we always check references. Usually our reference checks, we take directly out of the values questions or the skills test. So usually coming out of these two steps, we have a sense for like, where do we think their skills are a little bit weak and where are we worried that they might not fit in with our culture? And then we'll ask difficult questions of their references to see if we can get answers to get comfortable about those two areas. Usually by that point, we're comfortable enough where we wouldn't have to check references, but it's always a good habit. I don't think we've ever had a reference check that was like, wow, we definitely can't hire this person because their reference had bad things to say. But we definitely have always, like, or not always, but frequently learned new information that we didn't have. And so it's valuable to know that before the person joined the company. Yeah, so that's our process. Yeah.
How large was your team when you first implemented this?
We did this the first time in 2014, so we had 7 people. Okay. The first 5 people that we hired largely came through our network. And so, when you think about like somebody who's coming through your network, usually we would do some sort of project-based work with them first. That got us a chance to get to know both their values and their skills, although we didn't articulate it like that at the time. But there were people we like knew pretty well or came like highly recommended, and then we got to know each other over time, for sure. I think, interestingly, if I were going to start a new company now, like I'd probably implement some sort of process like this a little bit sooner, depending on like how well I knew the people that I was hiring. Sure. But definitely the people I didn't know at all, I would need to see like some sort of these two buckets. Yeah.
End to end, how long does this process take per applicant?
Yeah, sure. So if you think about, at its fastest, right, it can be done in like 2 weeks, right? So it can be very fast. And I think one of the things we'll probably talk about is like, a lot of what you'll identify is like, there are a couple candidates who you have high hopes for, and the rest of them are kind of average, right? And the high hopes candidates, you want to zing through the process as fast as possible because they're likely to be getting competing offers, or you want to express like, hey, I'm really interested, like dating, right? You want to show just how interested you are, but you want to be careful about it, right? So it's like this like weird game that you're playing, right? So but at times, right? If you think about the full step, usually they'll apply we'll take a week to like get back to people after we like just put up the job description, but then we'll be responding to people every day. Skills test 1 usually we give like 3 or 4 days, even though it takes 20 minutes. So it depends on how fast they respond to us. Phone interview usually takes a couple days to get the schedule right. Usually we use a calendaring tool to make that really easy. Skills test 2 usually is like a 3 to 5 hour test, something like that, maybe less, but probably 3 to 5 hours. And by this point, right, they've gotten to know us pretty well. That's like the goal. That's also the real goal of the phone interview is to get them through the next skills test.
And I assume you're reading out candidates.
Totally. And we'll look at a funnel in a sec to see just like how many people are making it through. But a lot of what you're balancing is, are we not weeding out enough people and therefore creating a lot of work for ourselves? Or, and why might that be? Like if too many people make it to the skills test 2, then like something's not working in your process. And then it's just the final interview. So it can happen very quickly, but usually hiring, we budget like 4 to 6 weeks at minimum. And depending on, like some roles are really freaking hard to hire for, and so those will take longer. Okay, yeah, so funnel metrics, right? So customer service person, right? So of the 1,100, resumes we got, right, 25%, we said like, okay, they have enough information to get to the skills test. Of those, half passed, right? Then 26%, made it through the phone interview, and then of those, like what was interesting here is the skills tests were relatively similar, right? Because the customer service job isn't like terribly complex. There wasn't a whole lot more depth we needed. So a lot of people you're finding passed there. And then the final fit interview tends to weed a lot of people out as we go really in depth with them. Email marketing, again, sort of different set of funnel metrics. We kind of keep track of this largely for every role. We have like rough data. We don't end up using the data that much because when you're in the thick of it, you'll get a feel for like how is this going? Am I having too many people? Am I spending too much time on candidates that at the end of the day I don't think are going to be successful? So a lot of it is like checking in every couple days to see like how do I think the process is going, and kind of managing it in a more dynamic way. Okay, so we use an applicant tracking system, right? Again, for me, it's like a lot, especially if you're hiring for multiple roles, you have to find a way to keep yourself organized. Also, if you're disorganized, you won't get back to people, and that's like terribly rude. And actually, many companies never get back to their applicants. And again, we look at it as like this is our brand, and like these people are going to go talk to their friends who may also be thinking about working for our company. And if they say, yeah, CourseHorse never got back to me, that just leaves a bad taste in their mouth. So for us, it's like if you're not organized, you're going to drop the ball on living up to, for us, is a core value. Of sort of like a customer focus. In this case, the applicants are our customers, right? So let's see. Yeah, so application requirements, right? So we like this where you're able to select, like to custom edit a question you can add to your actual application. So for us, you submit your resume and a cover letter, and then we always ask one skills question. Again, because a lot of times you can weed out a ton of people with just a very short question. So for the customer service one, it's like, let's say that a student wants to cancel a class, but they're outside of the school's cancellation policy. What would you say, right? And that's like a fairly nuanced question that takes 15 seconds if you're good at it, right, to respond to. So it doesn't deter applicants. But from the sensitivity, the empathy, the language that they're using in that email, we'll weed out like a huge number of people who just don't have the type of writing that we want. So each job has a workflow, right? So, again, it's like here are the different steps, and you can kind of see how people are moving through it. Templates, right? Ideally, you want to have all your messaging mostly pre-written, but to still have a personal touch to it, so that it's easy to move people through. I think I mainly listed this as a reference, but the rest of the stuff is pretty straightforward. Yeah. Yeah, again, I guess the other piece is just like a huge amount of doing well with this is saving time in the process. Otherwise, hiring will take up so much time that you'll put off hiring, or again, you'll just do a crappy job. You'll miss applicants that that were really good. You just won't see them. So a lot of this is to organize your work so that you spend time on the things that really matter. Okay, so a couple of different sources. Applicants, right? This is pretty straightforward, right? You can post on a job board. You can, that's like. That works in different ways for different roles. So for like sales roles, for customer service roles, job boards are really effective. For engineering, job boards don't work at all. So you have to apply, a different strategy. Referrals tend to be the best, right? If you can motivate your team to actively reach out to their networks and make this a huge priority as you go, they are without a doubt the best source of candidates and the people you will spend the least amount, like there are not that many coming through, so you spend a little bit of time, but you get a huge return on that investment because the applicants tend to be really good. Typically, we say with this is like always be hiring, right? And that's a lesson we've like over different periods of time lived up to and not lived up to. But the idea is that you should constantly, every person you meet from now on, right? You should think like, would I want to hire this person? Would I want to work with this person at some point in the future? That way, when you have a role you need to fill, ideally you already have somebody in your network that you feel confident about their fit and their skills enough to just reach out directly and hopefully hire them. So we say it's like important to create a bench. The same thing is true for people who come through the process but just aren't a fit for some reason, like timing. Maybe they just took another job, and so they were close, but you just sort of CRM them a little bit, reach out once every 6 months just to stay warm. And that way, when you're ready to hire for a role, you don't have to go through the whole process. Maybe you reach out to one person and they join the team, and that's happened to us a couple times. So this whole like referral thing can't be underestimated. For us, I think like more than half of our team has come through our existing network. Poaching, this is like, at some point you probably just have to start doing this because it's just harder and harder to find applicants for certain roles. And so, at the same time, it's really hard to do, right? Like mainly because, you're scouring LinkedIn, you don't actually know whether they have the skills for the job. So a lot of times you'll ask them to apply and then reject them because they can't do the job to the level that you need them to. You also don't know if they're looking for a job, right? So it's harder, but if you build a process and kind of manage it, you can increase the number of quality applicants that you have coming through. But it definitely takes a lot of time to figure out to get that messaging right. Recruiters, right? So recruiters are largely, you want to have a couple, you don't want to like have a ton of recruiters. Ideally have one or two who are really good. And when I say really good, I mean like they understand your process and your requirements, so they're not wasting your time with applicants that aren't worthwhile, right? You're still probably going to push all of their applicants through a similar process, but hopefully they've vetted them so that the number of applicants that make it through your process are much higher and almost resemble your referral rate. And if they're not, if you're talking to a lot of applicants from recruiters that are like, you're like, these people don't meet my needs, don't waste your time with that recruiter, because again, it's just a waste of time. And it's also really expensive, right? So I think I don't think we've ever hired through a recruiter. And we only in the last year have really started trying, but generally we've had enough success with our other channels that we haven't had to do it. Yeah.
Can you talk about, or will you talk about like hiring a team for those necessarily who don't have the funding to hire?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, sure. So in the early days, right, like if you can't pay people, for sure, it's like really difficult, right? So that means you have to bring them on in with some sort of equity plan, right? And for sure, what you want to do is have things in writing, right? Because the worst thing you can do is have somebody who like can claim co-foundership or some unclear amount of shares at some point in the future, right? So every relationship you have where somebody's working, like ostensibly doing work for the company, needs to be in writing in some way. You can have like a trial project or something like that, but even there needs to be some sense of like, what was the consideration, like what did you pay them in return for this work? When you can't pay them, salary, then you go to equity. And a lot of times, it's just like trying to figure out like, okay, what does that actually mean? Usually what you'll do is try to figure out, like at least in the early days, you use like a sample valuation of the company, right? So if you have nothing, maybe you call the valuation like $1 million, right? And so I'm gonna pay you a number of shares equal to a percentage of $1 million, right? So if you're doing easy numbers, right? $10,000 worth of work, I'll give you a 1/10% of equity or something like that. And it'll vest over the time that you're doing the work. So that's typically the way that you try to make sense of the dollars when there's no ostensible value to the company. And then it's a negotiation, right, over the valuation and over how much their services are worth, but at least you're structuring it in a way that like makes some sense and can get to a place where it makes sense for both parties. Usually I would say, I'm trying to think, in the early days, like we did both, right? So we had some savings that we put towards building things and like actually just like spending our own money. And then in other cases, we did put together like some sort of equity exchange. And a lot of times it'll like vest over time, right? So you're not like giving them equity immediately. It's like vesting over the time based on how much work they're doing. You can break the agreement at any time, but they still get some of their shares are still vested, right? And so you can like manage that relationship. Usually I think what people don't know is this notion of setting a valuation that you can benchmark off of. And a lot of the challenge is the earlier stage you are, right, the lower your valuation like makes sense to be, right? So it's better if you can do more before you start trading equity for things. Yeah.
Who owns the hiring process at CourseHorse, and how and has that changed over the years?
Yeah, so it depends on the role, right? A lot of times we want somebody who like really knows the art of whatever the job we're hiring for, like knows how to do it well because they can create the skills test. Now, so we hired a chief of staff, I think in 2015, and like now she manages like sort of the overall funnel, and usually we'll train her in like the skills test responses, at least for skills test 1 and for the sample question we put in the applicant, in the application. So, so she's kind of responsible. So she's responsible for project managing the whole thing, but she's working closely with a subject matter expert to create the tests and vet the applicants. And then as needed, she'll involve like the founders if we need to like sell somebody or, but she's kind of project managing it. Before that, I was doing it. Yeah, so, obviously the founders should be super involved in all hiring, up until, actually, we're still super involved, so I'm not sure at what point that changes. Maybe when you get like 50 people, but still it feels like you want to have a sense for, the other thing is like really like building trust with the people that you're involving in the hiring process. we found that not everybody is good at it, right? So like developing good skills tests is a skill, right? It's not like an easy thing to do. And like interviewing people from a values perspective is again like a real skill. It takes like a certain amount of listening and like empathy and yeah, I don't know, you just have to know people really well. Our chief of staff ended up being really freaking good at it really quickly. But there was only one other person on our team that we felt really good about including in a final round fit interview because everybody else, like, they weren't seeing the nuance that my co-founder and I were somehow able to see. It's also worth noting that the more practice you get, the better you get at it, right? So all this stuff. Skills test, like your first skills test will be a piece of crap, right? Because you just have never done it. This question was worded terribly because nobody's. You'll start trying different questions and you'll just, once you helping me at all. So a lot of it just takes practice. Yeah.
Do you use the platform for sending out the skill tests, or you just send them out?
Yeah, so that's what we use the applicant tracking system for. So ours is called Jazz. It used to be called Resumator, which I thought made a lot more sense, but Jazz, yeah. And we just like attach them to templated emails, and then it's easy to follow up with people if they haven't gotten back to you, that kind of thing.
What about the bi-weekly evaluation that you have?
The skills tests are all open response. So and it really depends on the role, right? We might provide them with a bunch of data, and then, for an email marketing role, right? We might provide them with like, here's the data from our last 12 campaigns, make 3 recommendations, right? And they're just doing that, and so we have to like read their Word docs or whatever they're sending back to us. But open response is the only way to do it, because you just get so much more nuance than you would in like a multiple choice type of thing. A lot of times we're trying to figure out like, how are the wheels turning in their head? And so we ask them like, explain your answer, and that's where we get more information. Okay, so to quickly go through the steps, right? Resume, things we look for is like obviously relevant experience in the role. We also really look for relevant experience in a startup environment, right? Because a lot of people come from big companies and just can't hack it at a startup. So that's an important like lens for us to look at people through. Consistency, loyalty to other jobs, right? Some people are like startup jumpers where they go to a different startup every year, so that's something you look out for. Designability, right? A lot of times, like, if we're hiring for a designer and their resume looks like a banker resume, then usually that indicates that something's a little bit off about, like, their designability. So sometimes we look for some consistency there, although it's not a major signal. Cover letter is really critical. Like, we really care about the cover letter, because one of the biggest ways that we hire people, or things we care about, is like people who really connect with our mission and like want to actually work for our company rather than just working for any startup, right? So a lot of times, I mean, frankly, also, most people who apply don't really spend a lot of time on the cover letter. And so from my perspective, I'm like, if you didn't spend a lot of time, then easy way to just like see how much they care. And then the skills question, like, again, like, can't emphasize enough how valuable it is to have just a very basic skills question. And usually we find like if they're not willing to answer it, then they're probably not a good fit for the job anyway, right? Because this is what they'll be doing for the job, right? So if they don't enjoy that kind of work, it's probably not a good fit. And yeah, it just does an amazing job of like giving you a sense for like, can this person actually do this job? Okay, so right, goals, so skills test, right? Goal of skills test. Mainly the idea here is that you can't look at a resume and know how good an applicant is, right? If they're coming through your network, maybe they've worked with somebody that you trust. That's a way to get it. The only way to see how good their work is to actually have them do some kind of sample work, right? So, goals, get a sample for their work. We want to like evaluate them not in like a gotcha kind of way, but we give them like it's like a take home for the most part. Sometimes we're tracking improvement over time. Like if we see that they did poorly in one part of a skills test, we may add a question to the next skills test. Because by the time they get to the second skills test, we're customizing things. Not many people should make it to that second skills test because it takes them a lot of time. So it's kind of rude to have a huge number of people doing that when you know you're only going to hire one. So you don't want to have too many people taking that second skills test. And then also, this is really important, right? It gives them a sense for how we approach work, right? They see usually the communication style that we use in the process. They see the effort that we put into like how we think about hiring people. They see what the work will actually be like, right? And these are the types of challenges that we're facing and that they're going to have to figure out. So it gives them a little bit of transparency into what life is like at the company. Building a good skills test, again, is hard. Usually we start with like, what are the core skills we need, right? And then like, what are like actual true to life scenarios that define that skill, right? So like data analysis, well, we got to provide them with some data and like have them analyze it. What are the most common questions we have when we, and maybe we'll give them the exact data that we have, right? And then, you know, we leave questions open-ended so they can't like guess the right answer. They can't game the test. They just have to like do the work. And that's the only way to know. Usually, yeah, so sometimes we do this, especially when it's a really new role. Agrees about what the skills are or how to. For this question, like, here's what we think a really good answer looks like. And that then helps. I don't create a scoring rubric until I have like 5 or 6 tests to look one back to back. Because again, the only thing that tells me the quality of a question is after I see some of the quality of the responses, right? And usually in the responses, you'll see a curve of people who are like amazing, awful, and then everybody in between. And it's the amazing people, obviously, that you were hoping to hire, but they also set the standard for like what is fair to expect as an answer to a given question. And then over time, you'll notice like I never eliminate somebody because of this question. It's either too easy or it's too hard, and therefore I ignore it. So then you'll start cutting those questions. Ideally, you want as short a test but as effective a test as possible. And that's a really, you know, a lot of it is just. So we'll put out a test. We'll get 10. Finally, 10 people will complete it, and then we'll look at them and sort of be like, okay. And then over time, that'll be a skill that you have. Better at forming what you've seen in the past. Yeah, so obviously the test depends on the role you're hiring for. For customer service, we just simply show them like, what if the student said this to you? What would you say back, right? And then our rubric is like, okay, how were they on, you know, English? How were they on like empathy? Did they use good judgment here? Did it feel genuine? Sometimes we'll talk about like, you know, let's say customer service, which is interesting because it's an easy to Google question, but don't take the time to do that. So we know like customer service is a lot like an effort related job. Sometimes we'll give things that are subtly testing, like are they willing to put in the work for that? For sales, we found like, can they write sales emails? So it's very similar to customer service. We have an email skills test, which is really easy if you're a good salesperson. And then we actually give them the script and ask them to take, you know, a few hours, and then we jump on a sample phone call. And the people who are good can actually sell it just by having spent a few hours with the script. And the people who are not, like, can't. And it just, like, unbelievably splits people out. And people, again, sometimes with the skills test, you're like, you had to see, like, are people willing to actually do this? And so you try it with a few people. If they get back to you and say, like, hey, that's too much work, then you start to modify it. Most times we found people are, like, actually willing to spend 3 to 5 hours if they're excited about a role. Email marketing or a Mother's Day send, right? Or some, like, pick. CSS. They have to like put design into it, so we're testing that. They have to write copy, so we're seeing like how good is their copy. And then our rubric will just have literally like a column for each one of those, and we'll score them 1 to 5. But we won't know what the rating is until we have 5 or 6 tests to look at. So sometimes, you know, it takes time to figure out what is fair to expect. First tech test, we don't do it anymore, but the first one was like build Twitter in 4 hours and like go. You know, and then like an engineer sort of looked at it and said, okay, yeah, they made good architectural decisions or whatever it was. Now our engineering team, I think, does paired programming. So they bring them in, give them a challenge. There's like some whiteboarding and then some paired programming. But yeah, those are sample tests. For operations, like if you're thinking about like what's a good question to include in an application, right? So customer service, we talked about just have a sample inquiry from a customer that they should respond to. We hired for like an operations role where we said, imagine you run like a peanut butter and jelly factory or like a Chipotle style peanut butter and jelly store where there's like 4 people assembling sandwiches, and you're finding that your line is always at the door. What are 5 ways that you could reduce the wait time but keep revenue or profit the same? And so, or I think we asked like, yeah, what are 5 ways? Or maybe we ask like, how would you approach that task, right? And you see like, what's their approach to problem solving, right? And so, the best ones will say like, well, I would first examine the process and see like, where are people spending their time? What's the bottleneck within, the assembly line? So people who really know operations will just use that language, and it's a really easy way to identify, can they do the job or not? Right, so phone interview is the first values fit test. The call is like, I'll take the first, like they spend time, give them like the 5-minute sort of elevator pitch on the role, the company, like why it's exciting, why they should join. Then I'll just, have usually like ask some questions, right? So it's like, I ask for like, what's their quick background to bring some color to their resume, but also to see, can they like tell a story? Can they narrate their own like life story quickly and efficiently? Because communication skills usually matter. We ask them like, why are you looking for your next thing, and why are you interested in working with CourseHorse? Those are basic questions that help, again, give you a sense for like who this person is and why they want the job. Usually we'll have 1 or 2 skills test questions, and they're like pretty simple things or just things to show us how nuanced their thinking is about a certain subject. And then usually we'll have some fit questions. Usually the fit questions are the ones that the most frequently fail people in the values interview. In other words, the reason we're choosing to put certain questions up here is because we don't want to feel like we got them all the way through the failed for a reason that we could have found them out for here. So, a lot of times, for example, we're good at dealing with conflict, right? So we'll try to ask to get a sense for like, sometimes we'll ask a fun question again, be a little bit more personal and authentic. And then again, right, we're trying to communicate, we're trying to be as freaking transparent. We're not wasting anybody's time. So as much information as we can give them to, quite frankly, make them not want the job, right? That'll save everybody time. But at the same time, obviously, we're trying to sell them, right? So it's like we want them to be excited about the challenges, right? But not just like sell them and then have them take a job that they thought was very different, right? That's the worst thing that can happen. Someone starts a job and they're like, this isn't what I signed up for. That's never happened with us, so I think it's largely because we're unbelievably transparent with this stuff. And then, we give them a chance to ask questions at the end, and those are usually pretty standard set of questions. A lot of times we can tell how interested they are and how they think by the questions they're asking. So that's another, just again, thing you learn over time is, how to listen to what questions they're asking and get a sense for like who they are because of them. Okay, so these are sample phone interview questions. Again, pretty straightforward. Again, it's like let's turn up any red flags we can so that we don't waste our time further down the funnel and we don't waste their time. These are sample describe a stressful work situation you face. Why was it stressful? How did you react? And that's such a broad question, right? Everybody defines stress differently. So the story they tell us might be something that happens at CourseHorse every day. And we're like, okay, you're going to be really unhappy here, right? Whereas, or like sometimes like, what's the hardest problem you've ever solved, right? If they give us a problem and we're like, that's not a hard problem to solve, that tells us something about whether they're going to be a fit or not, right? Or what's the hardest you've ever worked, right? If the hardest they've ever worked is like a 10-hour workday, then we're probably not a fit, right? There are going to be days where we're working like 15 hours, right? And so we have a sense for like, because these are not yes or no questions and they're not like really numerical questions, they're always like, tell us a story. From the story, we can glean so much more about fit than we would if we gave them just sort of an easier to answer binary question. We also try to pick questions that they can't necessarily predict. So we don't usually ask like, what's your greatest weakness? Because it's such an overused question, right? Even if we ask that, we might ask like, what are you best at and what are you worst at? right? And what that does is two things. One, it doesn't use the language that they're expecting, so it won't naturally call into mind the answer they had prepared. And two, we ask them for a strength first, and so it lowers their guard a little bit. So they're more likely to be honest with us about whatever the weakness is, right? So we're always trying to figure out, like, and a lot of this comes, again, you're going through it enough times and you're asking the same questions over and over, and therefore you're training yourself about what good answers look like and learning which questions are valuable. Yeah, friends like, needed to rely on a coworker for something and they let you down, right? And you can hear in their tone a lot of times, like, maybe they say the right words, but their tone indicates that they still are placing blame. Some people, you'll notice, always place blame on other people. No matter what question you're asking about some situation of adversity, it was never their fault, they were always somebody else's fault, right? And so just sort of notice nuances that they don't even know exist for them. And so that's why these questions are super powerful. Skills test 2, again, pretty similar, same sense as it's like, let's not be disappointed in their skill set in the first few months on the job, right? That's really the goal here. Okay, so the values interview, right? So talking about values. Values are the core of like how you're gonna figure out the company culture, how you're deciding whether people are fit or not. So when you're building your values questions, your fit questions, once you have your values, you can actually find really good, what are called competency or behavioral questions that test for that specific value, right? So if you want to test for integrity, there are actually questions that people have designed that test for integrity. And then you write the questions, you don't put all the integrity related questions together because that makes it really obvious, right? What are you trying to teach them? Instead, you structure the questions in the interview in an order that you're kind of bouncing all around. And it's really hard for them to get their bearings and to get comfortable, because as soon as they get comfortable, their ability to spin a story becomes much stronger, right? So throughout the values interview, you're keeping them on their toes. You're constantly bombarding them with questions that make them dig really deep for an answer. And in a way, you're exhausting their ability to sell you a story. But yeah, we often ask the same question in multiple ways throughout the interview, right? And a lot of times we get different answers, right? That's a way that you can dig deeper in a subtler way than saying, well, okay, give me another weakness, for example. And it becomes very powerful because usually the second half of the interview, they're being much more honest, or not honest, right? That makes it sound like they're lying to you, right? But they're just unable to spin as much of a story as they're able to in the first half, right? Because they're just a little tired from having to do all this like soul searching. Again, 2 interviewers, because one person should just be listening or sometimes asking for more information. Like I said, like content, like the words they say are like often not as important as the tone that they use or the expression they use, or like just the feeling they exude when they're talking about this situation from their past. A lot of times people are going to be vague. You'll ask them for a specific situation and they'll say, well, I never really have, or whenever this happens to me, I do this, right? That's a vague answer because you asked for a specific situation. The reason you ask for specific situations is it's harder to lie, right? Or it's harder to tell a story. When they go into something factual in their past, they're much more likely to tell you exactly what happened, and they're much more likely to have some sort of emotional reaction to that memory, which you can then observe and make a judgment based on. So when they're vague, or they kind of give you I work too hard, that's my biggest weakness, right? Like you can push them and have them like give you another answer, or can you about the same question in a personal scenario versus a work scenario, or what's your greatest communication weakness, right? So you put a specific spin on it, right? And so there are these different ways to like dig in further. A lot of times during the interview, you have like the 8 values or whatever in your head, and you're kind of checking off like, okay, I feel really comfortable when it comes to like work ethic and ownership, and they seem super goal focused, but I'm not sure about team. Like, do they care about the team? So then you're naturally skipping some of the questions you had in your list and focusing your time on the ones where you really have doubt, right? And that's why facilitating the interview takes so much energy, because you're evaluating like, where do I need to spend the majority? I don't have all day. I don't want to end the interview and still have things I'm uncertain about, right? That's your goal in this interview, because there's no time for a following interview. And if at the end you're unsure, then it's really hard to hire that person, or you have to make a decision, right? at the end, you want to be really confident about exactly where they stand with every value. And obviously, maybe we'll talk about this in a second. So this is really important. Like a lot of times, particularly if you've been moving them through the process, right? If you're the one who's like handled the skills tests and the other communication, you'll have an opinion coming into the final interview, and you don't want to one, influence other people, or two, have that historical opinion influence too much of what's happening in the interview. So that's something just to be mindful of, is your own personal biases. Really critical is to make a call right after the interview, right? This is something that's so easy to get lazy about and to say, okay, we just spent 90 minutes, we're both exhausted, let's go, I don't know, get lunch or do something else, do a work that we have to catch up on, and then you don't make a decision, and literally 5 hours later, you're like, yeah, what did happen? What did they say? What was that interview like? I don't remember, right? Especially if you have 2 interviews a day or phone interviews, like really hard to make a decision if you're not making it immediately. So you have to commit time in your schedule to say, like, we're gonna need 10, 15 minutes to like talk through which values did we feel good about, which ones did we not feel good about, which questions seemed worthwhile or not worthwhile. That's also how you create an iterative learning loop for yourself. That's how you're gonna learn about, you're gonna get better at sensing, people's values, is by having a really strong discussion afterwards. And you have to make the decision right after, otherwise it will be impossible later. Yeah. Yeah. These, yeah, no problem. Last thing I think with the values thing that we're frankly still learning over time is in the early years when we implemented this, we were pretty binary about it, right? We felt like they either have all the values or they don't, or they have all the values, or they're close enough on all the values that we feel good. Now what we're learning is that when you hire really strongly when everybody on your team is really indoctrinated a little bit into your values, you can be a little bit looser, frankly, hiring new people. You can understand where you're making compromises. Like if you need to get an incredibly new skill set, like incredible skill set that you don't have, and this person is just a little bit not perfect with conflict in the way that you'd like them to be, maybe they avoid conflict, and you're kind of like, that's not the best, but it's not like they're fighting with everybody on the team. They're actually more likely not to bring up their things, right? Then you decide where you can compromise, right? And when you're hiring, it's stronger to have people who have like, a lot of times when it comes to hiring, right, you want to have people on your team, each of whom has at least one like superpower, which means like they're the like best freaking person at this one thing on your team, but likely that means they have other weaknesses, right? Same thing with the skills test. If you find somebody who's incredible at one thing that you don't have on your team right now, that you might think like, gosh, I'll have to improve this person's skills in these areas, but this one skill is so freaking good that we desperately need it. Similar on the value side, right? If you feel like, okay, I understand where they sit on all of our values, and I'm comfortable with that because we can improve, or like once they're surrounded by 10 other people who really embody these values, they will change over time, or they'll adapt, and we've seen people do that over and over again. So you, instead of being super binary about it, over time you make decisions about where you can compromise. Okay, wait, this we already talked about. These are the same apparently. We kind of talked about this a little bit. Just what makes good questions. I don't think there's anything here that I haven't already said. Yeah, a lot of times we don't do these like gotcha questions, right? So we just are not trying to make people feel uncomfortable that they don't happen to know something that they feel like, oh, I should have known that. Usually we're not trying to catch people on that stuff. Yeah. Favorite final round questions. Right. We can't ask that first one, actually, because it's a little bit too close to being like there are certain HR illegal questions, right? And so, though that's not technically illegal, it like hints in that direction. For example, you're not allowed to ask like whether a person has a spouse or whether they have kids, because those are ways that people unfairly discriminate. So we used to ask this question because we felt like, like we're a family, and so, like if people feel comfortable talking about their family, it's like an easy question to answer. They can answer it in whatever way they want, but then at some point, actually our chief of staff was like, yeah, I don't think we can ask that, so we stopped. last 3 jobs, what did you like and dislike, right? So a lot of interviews have the person take me through your resume, tell me about what you did. That's not what this question is about. It's asking them, what did you like and dislike about the people, the environments, the cultures, right? And really what you identify is like, are the things they liked available, and are the things they disliked, true for us or not, right? So we have to figure out, like, if they didn't like something and that's the way life is going to be at our company, they might not be a fit. Hardest thing you ever worked for, we talked about that. I love this question, right? In the past, when you've had somebody on your team that you sort of haven't gotten along, what was the reason? Assumes to say, oh, that's never happened to me in the past, or they have to try a little harder to say that. And, like, you just always find that people have somebody, right? There was somebody, and you find out why that was, and you can start a conversation about conflict using that as the entry question. Can you tell us something you've done that you're sort of not really proud of, right? So, like, usually we'll actually start, the first question will be, what was your proudest moment? Or tell us about a courageous action or unpopular stand you made, right? So that gives them a chance to, like, show that they have, the guts to stand up for something, but also brag a little bit about a time they're proud of. Then we flip and we say, like, tell us something you're not really proud of. And it's kind of a really vague question, right? And it gets into, like, how does this person derive pride, right? You can really begin to identify, like, whoa, okay, it's interesting is some designers will talk about work they've done they're not proud of, and we're like, we don't care about your work samples. We're talking more about, like, personal situation that you're not really proud of, for example, right? So you can point it by starting vague. You'll learn more about how you needed to be more specific by saying, okay, now how about something you're not proud of in a work setting, or in a personal setting, or in a communication setting, whatever it might be. We don't ask this question anymore because we decided it wasn't worthwhile. Worked hardest to improve about yourself. So this is another way to ask the weakness question. What's your greatest weakness? In theory, they're working to improve it, right? So they'll be able to identify that there. It's also a humility question. If they really struggle to identify something, they're, like, introspective, like, self-improvement commitment. And then, of course, it fits one of our values. Last, formal performance review. I like this one because, again, it's trying to deal in fact rather than in, like, more, like, loose sort of storytelling. When you ask this, like, when was your last performance review? Ideally, they'll say, like, I don't know, I had one like a year ago or 2 years ago. What feedback were you provided? You're talking about a specific situation to be, untruthful. And because we structure it this way, most candidates know we're going to check references. So in theory, we might talk to that person. And so there, again, we're just, like, always trying to frame things in a way that gets us closer to the truth. Okay, key lessons. So, right, limited questions don't limit candidates, right? It's like if your funnel's not getting better or, like, narrower over time, right? And if you have questions that people are always passing or always failing, you shouldn't ask those questions, or you should change them. Big lesson was do skills test 1 before the phone interview, because the amount of time we were spending on the phone talking to people who then bombed the skills test and were really disappointing. Make the phone interview count. By that, in the beginning, our phone interview was too easy. Like, we just didn't cut enough people, and then they made it to the fit, and they just bombed the fit interview. And that's why we started to say, let's identify those red flag questions. These are the reasons that we tend not to hire people. Conflict resolution sense of team, like, they tend to be more individual, like, performers. They're not as good as collaborating. And then startup fit. A lot of people, like, are not that adaptable. That's how we vocalize that now, is adaptability. They're not ready for things to change. They're not ready for the budget to be zero. So they're not a great fit for us. We get back to every candidate. Again, this is, like, just a brand thing. It's like who you want to be. You'll be surprised by how many candidates that you turn down will say thank you for at least getting back to me, because most companies don't get back to people. Some emails get caught in spam, so that's something you have to be mindful of. Is like if you send a skills test and you never hear back, you have to check back in, because sometimes they're like, oh, I'm sorry, I never got the email. Oh, it went to my spam. So you'll check in back in with people. Keeping the pipeline strong is really important, right? So it's a funnel, right? It's a pipeline. So if you have a wave of like people apply in week 1, then by the end of week 3, maybe they're getting to the end. What if you're not ready to hire any of those people and you don't have anybody coming in the funnel? Then you have to start a whole new pipeline, right? So that's going to take another 3 weeks, which doubles your hiring process. So every day you're thinking, do I have enough people in the funnel so that if the people at the bottom of the funnel don't work, And the reality is, of course, that means that sometimes people are going through step 1 just as somebody's completing step 4. The work they did at step 1 might be a waste, but actually sometimes not. Usually if you hire somebody, you reach back out and say, hey, we ended up making an offer, but based on I'd always try to keep the pipeline strong. Balanced resources, right? The final people in the fit interview, again, if you've been marshaling people through the whole funnel, you're biased towards being done with the whole process, right? So like I found I was much more likely to be like, yeah, they're totally a fit because I'd been spending like 5 weeks trying to hire somebody. Whereas it was really healthy to have some like my co-founder who like hadn't spent any time at all coming to be like, nope, and nope, and nope. And like that was really powerful, right? Because we needed somebody who like didn't want to just be done, right? Making that final decision. Say the other lesson that's in here that I guess I haven't updated this, right? Like the biggest thing we've learned is that there's just a couple candidates, and from the very beginning you just know that they're the ones who like feel right. And you want to spend like 80% of your time on the 20% or the 10% or the 5% who really you think have a chance, right? Like who your all-stars are. We call them all-stars, right? So in the pipeline now, my chief of staff and I, like we have, in every conversation, we make, because we kept forgetting to do this, and then you spend all this time getting back to all these people and like moving all these people through, but none of them are interesting, and the one who you really were excited about dropped off, right? And so you failed, right? Because your job was to get that one person through. So now in every meeting about hiring, we check in on the all-stars and find out like where are they? Why haven't they gotten back to us? Or if they like, what are their concerns? Like how are we doing with this very small group of people that we feel like really is amazing? And like, you know, like again, sometimes we say like, okay, we don't have time. Let's not get back to people for a couple weeks because like, or not, let's not get back to the people who we're not excited about. One is like, let's not waste their time, but also we don't have time. And if we're just a little late, it's okay, as long as we get back to them eventually. So that's another thing, like sometimes we'll compromise on our timeliness in order to make sure we're actually accomplishing the goal, which is focusing on the candidates that we really think are gonna be a fit at the end of the day. And again, I can't emphasize enough, like it's always like you have one or two people, right? 100, 200. Yeah, I got this one person who I really think is the one. And you know, you'll have a few and they should make it to the end very quickly. Okay, that's all. That was a long time. Question, any of that stuff or really about anything else? Yeah.
You mentioned that in order for you to come up with the job descriptions, prior to that you have to already understand what the roles are, and that's because you already have somehow systematized your business, right?
Totally.
So can you address a little bit that with the relationship between systematizing the business and arriving to the job description so you know actually what exactly you need?
Yeah. So, you know, for us, even still now, it's changing, right? Like we'll hire somebody and they'll be like, yep, we don't need that anymore, but we really need these other skills and you have them. So, you know, so it is very fluid, particularly early days when you don't have like specific roles with specific requirements. A lot be dealing with like, well, what are the problems? Like, what's the vast different things of different skills that they'll need to be able to do first, then I need to test them in a diverse set of skills, right? If I need them to be really good at like email marketing, then I got to go really deep in that, right? And so maybe, you know, maybe they need to be somebody who can do like, can be great in a brainstorm. So maybe you'll have like a brainstorming interview where you're like, okay, I'm looking at these 3 projects and we're trying to just come up with new ideas. So we're going to give you 5 minutes to read the project and then we're just going to see what comes out of your brain because like that's kind of what we think we need, right? So a lot of times it's just like, trying to imagine the situations that you're going to throw this person into, and then trying to come up with skills tests based on that.
So for instance, I'm glad that you brought the email marketing because like right now that's one of the things we need the most. But I guess for that, if you need somebody to help you with that, which can be like once a week, right? Like your weekly newsletter.
Totally.
Then you don't need someone as an employee because that's a huge expense.
Totally.
You just do what? Hire somebody as a subcontractor?
Yeah, so you can hire a contractor or freelancer, yeah, for sure. But you still give them the sales test, like the skills test, right? So all subcontract, again, we have like 150 people offshore, we have like 6, 7 people remote in the US, a couple people in the Ukraine, right? So we're all over. Everybody goes through some sort of skills test because it's the only way you know whether they can actually do the job or whether you'll find out a month in, oh, wait a second, they're just not able to like do certain things that I need them to do. So freelancers in particular, you'll want to give some sort of test or a sample project, right? A freelancer, you might have to pay to do a sample project, but you'll get a feeling early on.
What would you say is the normal kind of compensation for someone who will work a few hours a week on your email marketing on a weekly basis?
Yeah, it really depends. For email marketing, it depends on exactly what you're looking for, right? If they need to be able to like look at analytics and make decisions based on them and like do merchandising, you might pay, I don't know, from something like $30 to $50 an hour, right? If they just need to be able to like follow like a wiki that you've created that tells them step by step how to do something, then maybe like $10 to $15 an hour is possible. Cool. Yeah.
I'm sorry, just to finish the question.
Yeah.
You should expect it in the second case, it's pretty much to maintain your newsletter campaign every week. You should expect them to do that for how many hours?
Again, it depends, right? So for us, it's a fairly intensive job, but I can imagine doing it for like 5 hours a week. Like if it's just like I need to send one email out and just like think about the messaging.
Perfect, thanks a lot.
Cool.
You talked a lot about hiring and metrics, to make sure that things are going well. But what are the company's strategy to keep people motivated, keep people both, in smaller teams and as a bigger?
Totally, that's a great question. So for us, a lot of this, like we're small enough where we can just literally ask everybody, right? So we have these one-on-ones where we're very regularly checking in and just saying like, hey, how are things going? And what's critical for us is that we create an environment where people are transparent with us. And it's the hardest freaking thing to do, is to just get people to tell you what's wrong. Because most environments are sort of anti, feedback oriented. And so we found over time that, we voice it in our values. We are constantly asking for feedback. We're constantly both surveying people for feedback and asking for it in meetings. But still there are some people that you just can't get to tell you what's wrong with them. And in fact, now we've really started to identify that in hiring, because a lot of times those people are just going to be unhappy and sort of wallow in it. And even if you try to you can tell, because we're perceptive people, right, that they're unhappy, but you just can't get them to open up. It ends up being a huge waste of your time and resources. And then they end up leaving because you're for reasons that you feel like you probably could have fixed. So number one is we hire for people who are more upfront with the things that bother them, right? And we'll ask questions like that. When was the last time that you were, frustrated with something at work? Can you describe a frustrating situation at work? And then we'll see, what did they do about it? Did they just deal with it, or did they say something, right? And so that's a really good indicator. So we try to hire those people. Then we try to reinforce that we want feedback, and we do that by, talking about it all the time, surveying people regularly. And then most importantly, right, respecting that when someone gives you feedback, it's the biggest risk they're ever going to take at the company in a way. And so you have to respond really well to that, particularly if it's in front of a group. So no matter what words they use, what tone they use, what their language, all that stuff, you have to set your own sort of ego and response, whatever mechanism aside, and do whatever it takes to encourage feedback. Then later you can say, hey, can I give you some feedback about how you framed that? And that was a question I felt attacked in front of the whole team at once. So this type of stuff, let's just talk together one-on-one, right? But in the moment, you have to honor that they're taking the risk, and it's better they're giving you the feedback than if they hadn't given it to you at all. So those are the two things we do from an environment perspective. I think, again, in the one-on-ones, a lot of times, when you have a small team, it's nice because you can pay attention and you just have a sense for how everybody's doing. And the one-on-one is a great moment to really look at them and really get a sense. We also now do a thing, my co-founder and I, where once a week we just take 20 minutes and we just think about everybody on the team in an intentional way. Just get a feel for do I know where this person is? How are they feeling? What's my sense? And as soon as we have a blank spot, we'll schedule a one-on-one or make sure they're coming up. So we're always keeping track. We're exploring things now like team surveys and on a more frequent basis to see how are things going, how's the sentiment at the company. But for the most part, we deal with it one-on-one right now. Yeah.
In terms of what you were just saying, how does it work with your offsite team?
Yeah. So each team has a different culture, but we are very intentional about the culture we create, right? So for example, I have a remote sales team that I'm working with, right? And the biggest challenge is gosh, like they're working remotely, sales can be tough, right? You deal with a lot of rejection. So how do we create a sense of community and culture? Sales is a very like it's a very similar day in and day out, so it's easy to feel disconnected from what's happening at the rest of the company. So a lot of times what we'll do is like first frame that, right, at the beginning. As soon as we're hiring everybody, like in onboarding, we're like, hey, the biggest challenge we think we're gonna have is culture, and we need your help to tell us when you feel disconnected or when you feel whatever, disengaged, or when you're struggling, right, all that stuff. In this case, with the sales team, we have a morning stand-up at 9 a.m. every day for half an hour, where we're all on Skype. We can all see each other. Feels very natural. Skype's really good for this, I would say. That's been huge. They each have one-on-ones with each other every week to talk about their day and like get to know each other, which has been really strong. We're really connected to the whole team via Slack, so that's been really good. We have a Friday, what we call retro, where we have an hour-long meeting. We extend the half an hour to an hour, and we do roses, thorns, and discussion items, where people can say, here's what went well, here's what didn't go well, and here's like stuff that, can we change this, or I like this, or whatever. And so like, so far that amount of communication has been really good. But it's something we're always paying attention to, and I'm always asking like, hey, do you guys feel connected? I also have one-on-ones with them. Now with the offshore like operations team, like mainly it's like a data entry team. So the operations team has a lot less like cultural stuff happening, and largely it's just about like metrics and like getting your job done in the 20 hours you give us per week. And so we're very light on culture because it's not that necessary. We do, however, have an offshore customer service team, where the customer service team here has done a lot to make them, again, feel a sense of team, feel a sense of culture. They're really valuable people, because if they're good, they're like really good, and still like way cheaper than we could hire here. And so, we like last week there was an ice cream social where everybody was on Skype with ice cream, and like we gave them budget for that, and like, so the little things you do where you're just, a lot of times it's just like asking the question, like caring about it, and then committing to some sort of behaviors. And then usually, if those two things are in place, like you'll find the right behaviors over time. Yeah. Yeah.
How big is your team again?
Okay, so right now we have 16 in our office here. We have now 6 or 7, I guess, remote in the US working on like sales and marketing stuff. We've got 2 in the Ukraine who are QA engineers. We've got 10 in the Philippines who are customer service, and 140 who do like data entry, lead generation, a number of other sort of tasks that we need. So yeah, the sun never really sets on our empire.
Because I came to your talk, I guess, before last semester.
Yeah.
And you doubled your team since then, maybe? I don't know.
Maybe.
You've added a lot of people.
We might have had, we've hired a few, like 3 or 4 people here in the office here. We have the whole remote sales team started in January, so that's definitely a new addition. It's been going weirdly like well.
And did you do all the hiring for that also? Or?
For the sales team I did,
So
yeah.
for this entire process?
Yeah, pretty much the exact same thing.
And you did that with all the 140 data entry people, or?
That was different. We don't do fit with them.
Okay.
We just do skills. Again, it depends on like the nature of the task.
Freelancers.
They're all freelancers, yeah. So we're not working with an organization. They're all contracted with us individually, but they're freelancers. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What is the reason, I guess the most popular reason why people leave CourseHorse? And
Yeah.
what are you doing about it?
Yeah, sure. So let's see. Let me think through. So we had the person like that actually I described, right, who was like unhappy about the amount of time we were committing to kind of like her area of focus, and then also unhappy about like it was a stressful time at the company actually for everybody. We were like fundraising, numbers weren't that great, things like that. But largely we struggled because she wasn't really willing to talk about it, and so we couldn't ever actually find out what was wrong or do something about it. So she ended up leaving for a nonprofit where she felt like I think she felt a stronger like values alignment, for herself, which was great. It was we were super disappointed about it because I think we felt like once we understood where she was coming from, it was the type of stuff where we were like, oh, like if we had known about this or been aware of it, this is exactly who we want to be, or like where we were definitely failing on a few things, and so that was like one frustrating situation. We hired a salesperson 2 years ago who lasted only 6 months. We had a hypothesis that you don't have to have had a history in sales for you to be a good salesperson. And I'm sure that's true, but obviously sales also isn't for everybody. He was a Teach for America teacher, love him, amazing cultural fit, and was actually very good at sales, but ended up not really enjoying the sales job. And then he decided to go be a comedian in LA. So love him, but he's no longer here. And then we had an engineer, our first engineer left a few years ago. That was a challenge where, it was just a challenge of like, when you're growing the team, there's always a question of, are the earliest people on the team going to be in charge of the new people? And I think he wanted to be in more of like, we have a flat structure. Only like last month did we start really having a hierarchy of any kind. But I think he was more comfortable with being in like a sole position of like leadership over the engineering team. And so that ended up not like, our culture just didn't end up being a fit, which I think wasn't something either of us knew before he started work. He was with us for 2 years and then was like, I think it's time for me to go like lead a larger engineering team somewhere. So that made sense. I'm trying to think. I think like, yeah, most like there are people on the team that were like very mindful of like, here are the things that are frustrating them like right now, right? So a lot of times like people like, they're just having too much work and they're like struggling to keep up with it. But what's interesting about that is a lot of times it's the expectations they set for themselves, not that we have for them. And so a lot of times you're dealing, like you're in many ways like you're psychologist or therapist for the team, right? You're figuring out like what like thought patterns have they developed that, aren't that healthy, but that aren't like, we don't feel like they have to work like this, but they're putting themselves through it. So that's a lot of times you're like saying, you have to reinforce like, we don't think you need to do this, like don't beat yourself up over this thing because it doesn't actually matter, right? So a lot of times you're helping identify what's making people miserable and is it just a thought that they're believing that they don't need to believe? I think, I think in terms of like on the other side, right, of us like letting people go, one of the, it's like so much of this stuff that we're talking about now and all the startup advice, everything I've ever read, it's the type of thing where you read it and you understand it intellectually, but until you go through it experientially, it's not real for you. And so a thing that I read very early on is like, like startups and generally people don't let go of people fast enough, right? And like, I was like, okay, we're not gonna be the company that does that, but we're definitely a company that does that, right? We just like hold on to people who don't have the skills or aren't a cultural fit. Actually, cultural fit hasn't been a problem. Mainly it's like they don't have the skills that we need. And we keep thinking like that it's a communication issue or that we can train them in those skills. But at the end of the day, we're just like, it's not gonna work out. And instead of us making a decision about like, hey, it doesn't feel like it's working out, we should like really take steps to assess like, is that true? And like give them an opportunity to like really prove that they can do it or make a decision to move on. And like, the amount of extra work that people who can't carry their own weight create for the rest of the team is enormous, And so you just can't underestimate how valuable it is to be quick about whether somebody is like carrying their own weight or not. And then of course, when they're not, right, you then look at our skills tests, like how did we miss this like lack of skill set and what do we need to figure out next time when we hire for this role?
How do you evaluate whether people are misperforming or not? Is it
Yeah.
just like, they're not getting your deadlines or?
It's a mix, right? So all the work is different, right? So sales numbers is like, okay, are they hitting their number or not and why, right? You can usually look into that. So that's a really easy one, right? In most other situations, it's like, we're only 16 people on the team, right? So it's nice because we're working pretty closely with everybody. And you have a sense for like, are they hitting deadlines? Like, are deadlines like a real thing by which they operate? Or are all deadlines kind of floating and you can never really depend on them, right? What's their reliability like, right? Now, reliability breaks into a bunch of different categories, right? One is like timeliness, like a sense of urgency about like, hey, we should get this done sooner rather than later. But it also depends on like, did they achieve the goal of the task or did they finish it on time and then I just had to redo it, right? And so a lot of times you're looking at how much rework are you doing, how much feedback are you giving, how much repetitive feedback are you giving to the same person over and over and you're like, I'm still having the same problem with this person. That's why it's also really helpful to keep a file in a way of like once a week you're looking and saying like, I struggled with this person this week. I need to have a conversation with them about it in the next 2 weeks. And then you keep checking back and you're like, is it improving or not over time? I think like, really that concept of like rework, or a lot of times you'll just have a sense like, I need somebody to do this, and I can't trust this person to do it, right? And like you'll just have that gut, and you have to be honest with yourself. One, that you have that feeling that you're like shying away from giving this person a task, and then like figure out like why is that, and you have to have this awareness of like, what is it that I'm gonna give it to them. They're not gonna get it done on time, and then when I get it, I'm gonna have to redo it. Okay, well that's pretty serious, right? Like what is it about that task that they're unable to do, and is it that I haven't spent the time to give them the training, which is often the case. A lot of times, transitioning from being an executor to a manager is about, instead of getting a task done in the most efficient way, it's training somebody else to do it so you don't have to do it, and you create leverage for yourself that way. But some things can't be trained, right? And like, for example, examining a large data set and identifying trends or a next step, that's a hard skill. Like it's a hard skill, right? And like we don't have the ability to like train people in that. We can suggest people who are already good at it, we can make them better at it, right? But people who just have no idea where to begin, it's like, we don't have that luxury because we're too small. So you have to identify, do they have the skill set? And if they don't, or you were wrong, your skills test, like you keep giving them tasks and you keep not getting enough out of it, then you have to make a decision. Yeah, it's tough. And it continues to be tough, I would say. But then what's interesting is that once you make the decision, this is also something I read and turned out to be true, once you make the decision, you feel great. Because you're just like, oh, this is just such the right decision, So as soon as you either make it personally, you feel great. Then when you communicate it, you also feel great. It's like ripping off a band. It's not fun, obviously, but you still feel great because you're like, it's the right thing to do. And I've known it all along, but I haven't been willing to face that fact. So you feel really good when you end up letting go of people who, weren't the right fit for your organization at the time. Yeah.
So say if you have someone that they don't have all the skills you need.
Sure.
But in terms of getting those things done, do you feel like, if you don't have to train them, should they go figure it out?
Totally. So we have a very much like a figured out mentality, right? And that's something we hire for and train, and the skills tests are like somewhat designed in that way. And our values interview will figure out if they're a figure outer type person. Some things you can figure out, right? If it's like how to use a new CRM system, like that's a figure out type task. It's a software, just learn how to poke around and use it. That's what I'm gonna, a lot of times it's like, hey, this is what I'm gonna do. If I'm figuring it out, then you should be able to figure it out. Sometimes, it's a harder skill that you're training them in, right? So those things, maybe it's like, go sit with this person, go look at this training, and like, none of us is good at this, so someone's gonna have to take on that task of becoming an expert. And there are certain people who like are better at that. We probably don't hire specifically like for that. I don't know, so that's a trickier one. It depends on the task at the end of the day. But we definitely, like again, right, you wanna hire people who have one dramatic skill set strength that your team doesn't have, and you're willing to compensate for their other skill set deficits because of that, hopefully because you have those other skills already on the team, and they can learn from each other, and also those skills in that role, right, aren't necessarily the most critical ones. A lot of times, though, because your company is constantly changing, you need to kind of be aware of, like, what is each person really good at? And if we go in this new direction, like, will we be short-staffed? Like, will our staff not be capable of executing? And so that's another question. Like, when, you stop doing sales, like, what are your salespeople going to do, right? Can they do marketing? Well, what are those skill sets? And so you have an awareness of, like, how flexible people can be based on their skills. But then, of course, they have to be flexible. Right? So if they got hired for a sales role, maybe that's what they want to do. They don't want to do marketing, then that's a different sort of problem.
Nihal, I just want to thank you again for leading today's session. You've done such an amazing job really highlighting the importance of culture and values and how both of those really can influence your hiring process. And then even beyond that, how you keep your culture and your values and every day through one-on-ones and Friday feels and what was Thursday?
Thursday Thoughts.
Thursday Thoughts. I'm
It's
sorry.
all alliteration. That's all we do.
I think this has been such a great session. And as everyone here hopefully eventually starts their own companies, I think you'll quickly find that early stage founders are so involved in the hiring stage for at least the first few years, if not more than that. And any way that you can find that kind of makes it more efficient, but more than that, helping you find better people faster is so important. You've really given the group such a strong foundation in how to start.
Cool.
And again, thank you for everyone for coming today. We have a few upcoming startup school sessions that I hope will be of interest. This Friday, we have a session on how to storytell. So not just storytelling to investors, but how to win over a crowd if you're doing a pitch or anything like that. It's going to be a great session. It's during the lunch hour, 12 to 2. We'll order pizza. And then we have a few sessions next week as well. On Tuesday, we're running a session on measuring and monitoring metrics that matter. So I know someone over here asked a question about, I think you asked a question about metrics. Maybe? Someone asked a question about metrics. It was a great question. We're going to be continuing the topic of metrics, not just, how do you set metrics with people on your team, but how do you set metrics as a company? How are you setting goals for every quarter, and how are you measuring on those goals? So that will be on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, we're running another new session called essentially creating your product market plan. So I have a friend named Megan who's going to be leading that session. She's a really early employee at MongoDB. I think she's number 7. And she's really led up all of their marketing. So she's going to give a really good presentation. And I hope to see you all there. And if you have any other questions, we'll be here for another few minutes after the session. Let's give Nihal another round of applause, please. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm just in the hall at CourseHorse.
Okay.
I think I chose not to send them out last time.
Oh, okay.
This time I'll just make probably a couple of pieces of presentation
Okay.
and send it.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Should I just email you?
Yeah, just shoot me an email.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I can also send them to all of the attendees once you give me one that's okay to send out.
Yeah. Yeah. So either way. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm UC.
Nihal, good to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Oh, nice. Okay.
I'm gonna go look. Mike's worked.